Hello, I'm Samuel Inglis, and for this hopefully brief little essay that I am doing for my Masters of Screen Editing course, I intend to talk to you about 1995's The Usual Suspects, and how it relates to something I'd like to call crescendo montage. But what is crescendo montage? As the name suggests, it is a form of montage. Montage is commonly known as a cinematic technique where snippets of film are connected to each other in a way that implies the condensation of time. Think an athlete training for a big game, or a child growing into a man over the space of a minute or two. But it has other manifestations, most famously its first form when it was conceived by Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein. In Eisenstein's films, montage was intended for the purpose of conveying thematic information through a stark intercutting of complementary or dissonant images, creating symbolic meaning. Montage is not just about condensing time, it is about condensing place and feeling, and though it has become primarily defined as a way of condensing a story's timeline, the earlier form of montage is still very much alive, such as in the iconic Godfather trilogy.
Do you renounce Satan?
I do renounce him.
For the climaxes of all three of those movies, there is a sequence of familial and love-based imagery juxtaposed with the death and destruction of organized crime. Another example would be the famous Order 66 montage from Revenge of the Sith, where the universe is united in a moment of abject tragedy and despair, punctuated by the irrational hope of a household droid.
The Chancellor's office indicated Master Anakin returned to the Jedi Temple. Don't worry, I'm sure he'll be all right.
Crescendo montage is neither of the aforementioned things, at least not in its function. While common-style montage speeds up time, and symbolic Eisenstein-style editing takes a moment in time and injects into it every possible bit of irony, pathos, and tragedy that you could imagine, crescendo montage is about building up to one moment. No shot or symbol ever means nearly as much to a viewer as the one in the sequence's final moments. Why? Because every shot and sound prior was designed deliberately to build anticipation for that final moment, when all the tension of the scene is ultimately, spectacularly released. In many ways, it is the montage's answer to the Hitchcock boardroom bomb scenario, where the audience is made aware of something terrible that will happen soon, in Hitchcock's example, a ticking time bomb going off, if it is not stopped by a character first. However, what sets apart a crescendo montage from a boardroom bomb scenario or a car chase that grows in intensity is that the suspense is derived not primarily from what is in the frame, but rather the order in which the images are arranged. In The Winds of Winter, the season 6 finale of Game of Thrones, we are treated to a series of images that by themselves seem innocuous, such as two women being dressed, a monk chasing a street urchin, and people walking through dark hallways. Though the lighting and framing suggest a somewhat foreboding mood of themselves, they do not contextualize the scene as a frame from a car chase would. The script likewise does not orient us as it would in a classic Hitchcock suspense scenario, like Sabotage or Torn Curtain. Yet already there is a palpable air of suspense and dread because of two things. First is the intercutting, as it informs the audience that in some capacity all these strands are connected, but without a clear reason why. This creates anticipation. But you have another element in the scene that tells the audience that something bad, or at least something significant, is coming. The music. Yes, crescendo montage, perhaps obviously given the name, requires the momentum of an accompanying musical piece that must escalate in volume and intensity. As this piece builds, the images become more self-evident, with a stabbing, an ominous green liquid, and a few malevolent facial expressions. However, the cutting also becomes quicker, giving the audience less time to register the specifics of the images they see, while still receiving the essential visual points of development and danger. Suspense is heightened as the audience is being further provoked into anticipation. The cuts increase as time is stretched. The music gets louder, reaches its peak, and then... one moment, the only moment, that narratively speaking matters, and 12 minutes to get there. And while the explosion itself is very interesting to look at, that it comes after all that build-up not only gives it narrative power, but also artistically justifies lingering on the spectacle. After all, the spectacle is what relieves the tension. To dwell on it is just to be a fair storyteller. A crescendo montage is a common tool, arguably originating with Alfred Hitchcock's 1934 thriller The Man Who Knew Too Much, though certainly made famous by the 1956 remake of the same name with James Stewart and Doris Day. In that Albert Hall-set climax, the three tenets of the crescendo montage are established. 1. The audience begins with little to no forward knowledge of the events of the montage, in particular what the crescendo moment could be. 2nd, the montage is driven by a musical piece of rising intensity, informing the audience that a significant moment is coming, which will coincide with the musical crescendo. And 3rd, the importance of the information provided in the image is inversely proportional to the time spent on it, meaning a crescendo montage begins with longer shots of innocuous things and ends with shorter shots of important things. This sequence is arguably the most famous example of crescendo montage because of how perfectly it fits the story. The ultimate result of crescendo montage is that, because of the combined effects of audience anticipation and time stretching, one feels trapped in a moment of life-changing decision, which is convenient, as the character of focus, Doris Day, is in exactly that sort of moment. Because of crescendo montage, we empathize with her. However, crescendo montage's ability to slow down time can be useful for more than just putting your audience into the mindset of the split-second decision. Which brings me to what may be the greatest instance of the crescendo montage in all of film, the final scene of The Usual Suspects.
Man, you're a slob.
Yeah, but it all has a system, Dave. It all makes sense when you look at it right. You gotta, stand back from it, you know?
The montage begins with a dispassionate mid-wide shot of the characters of Agent Kuyan and Sergeant Jeff Rabin, but the shot is not still. It zooms in on the two characters, indicating our attention should be on their body language. Editor John Ottman then cuts to the other side of the desk, matching the previous shot with another zoom-in shot, but this time one that only shows the face of Kuyan. He is consequently established as the sole character of interest for the audience now, and when Ottman cuts back to the first angle again, the camera has zoomed in so tight that Rabin's face is no longer visible. The audience now understands that the initial zoom was not just a way of emphasizing the importance of Kuyan over Rabin, but also the importance of the notice board behind Rabin. With just 3 cuts, Ottman has put us both into the mind of Kuyan and given us the same objective as Kuyan, to focus on that notice board. He is arguably slightly ahead of us in terms of mental processing, but that time will soon be made up. The music starts, then we cut back to Kuyan's face, where the zooming finally stops. Before the montage has even truly begun, we are already in a state of empathy with the character of focus that usually only occurs in the frantic concluding cuts of the Hitchcockian crescendo montage. Then something truly incredible happens. Multiple times, though the same event. This is something of an old-school editing technique, but one in this case that not only stretches time, but makes this one moment almost infinitesimal. By doing this, John Ottman has not only allowed us to catch up with Kuyan's comprehension, but also given himself an opportunity to justify both launching and halting his momentum, basing the near entirety of his crescendo montage in that final stage of frantic cutting.
Where? Some guy in California, his name is Redfoot.
A gift from Mr. Sauzet.
Talk to me, Verbal.
What about Redfoot? Mr. Redfoot knew nothing. Using pawns.
Big, fat guy. I mean, like orca fat.
I was a lawyer.
Myths, legends of
Kobayashi.
I'll never see him again. Back when I was picking beans in Guatemala, we used to make fresh coffee.
However, by not overshooting the pace of the rising music and observing the gradual increase of shots per second as outlined by the third rule, the blueprint of the crescendo montage is still followed. Yet the frantic overlaying of sound clips ensures the sequence does not feel like it has reset itself, a particularly wise move considering the montage had to give its audience a chance to catch up. Even better still, the coverage Altman has to work with is not as stationary as the coverage of other crescendo montages tend to be. With pans and zooms aplenty, he matches that momentum between shots and even cuts down the frame, creating a sense of skipped motion.
I know you thought he was a good man.
I know he was good.
And tell me every last detail.
Strangest thing.
How do you shoot the devil in the back?
This country is protected from up on high by the prince. And tell me every last detail.
What about a pretzel, man? What's your story?
There was a lawyer.
What lawyer, Verbal?
I am Mr. Kobayashi.
Kobayashi.
Tell me every last detail.
I work for Kaiser Soze.
Convince me. Convince me. Convince me.
When the montage finally reaches its crescendo as Kuyan notices the bottom of his coffee mug, the intercutting eyeline match zoom used prominently a third time, the audience is still satisfied by the revelation despite the unorthodoxy of the crescendo montage. Why? Because of the expert way Ottman was able to find shortcuts with the coverage he had. Bryan Singer and his cinematographer Newton Thomas Siegel had filmed a lot of vivid, dynamic close-ups, and by simply allowing the camera work to essentially speak for itself in the opening few 30 seconds, a wealth of opportunity was granted. Ottman followed the emotional beats of a crescendo montage exactly, while both shortening and extending its form, telegraphing the changes to the viewer so that confusion over time stretching would not pull them out of the moment. Ottman, for an editing style often used to depict grand set pieces in large sets that usually end with explosions or gunfire, vividly portrayed what the human mind goes through in a single second. I think a particular secret ingredient to the brilliance of this scene is to do with the fact Ottman composed the music for the crescendo, allowing a certain level of particularly sophisticated pre-planning. It's interesting to note that in the scene as written in the screenplay by Christopher McQuarrie, there is very little that dictates how the scene is supposed to be cut. The repeated action of the coffee mug exploding on the floor in particular was conceived in post. Crescendo montage itself is a form that creates suspense just from the power of editing and music. But even by that standard, the climactic revelation of the usual suspects created a narrative dynamism that had barely even been hinted at until the cutting room. Ottman is an inspiration to me, regardless of what that scene from Bohemian Rhapsody did to his reputation.
I've got to make an impression, darling.
You look like an angry lizard. It's your best work. Very subtle. You're gonna fly away. Can I borrow it for Sunday church?
But really his magnificent work is just a testament to how much I love this type of sequence. Every time I see a crescendo montage, I get completely drawn into a film, and my highest aspiration as an editor is to master this type of sequence. Ideally, I would love someday to create the sort of editing spectacle seen in The Man Who Knew Too Much and Game of Thrones, but things like The Usual Suspects and even the staring competition from Kill Bill Volume 2 showcase the broad applications of this style of montage. It would be interesting especially to explore whether such montage is possible in the form of documentary, both in terms of practicality of execution and, perhaps more importantly, ethics of use.